Hello everyone, and hello in particular to all of my new subscribers. Last week was an exciting one for old JJ. Not only did it mark my first ever trending video, it also saw my subscriber count pass 30,000 for the first time. So that's kind of big. In last week's video, I drew the last 11 US presidents, which you guys seem to enjoy. And since that video was so popular, I thought for this week I would do a follow-up in which I would draw 10 more presidents. But I won't do them in chronological order like I did last time. Frankly, a lot of the presidents are really boring, and if you're anything like me, you probably don't even know what half of them look like anyway. So instead, what I'm going to do is just draw the 10 most famous ones. Enjoy.
Okay, so the first we're going to do is good old George Washington with his frilly hair. Not actually a wig, despite common misconception. He has a sort of big nose and these very sort of stern eyes. He's a very sort of stern-looking man with a very serious facial expression in all the paintings that we see. He sort of has a quite broad jaw, pretty serious facial expression, and of course his weird 18th century clothes with that sort of cravat scarf and this big sort of dark, broad-shouldered coat that he always wears in all of the famous depictions of him. And then he's got that little pigtail at the back of his hair as well. We'll just add a bit of color here with using these fine Copic markers to add a bit of shade and 3 dimensions to it. I'm going to just sort of shade his scarf and other areas where there would be shadows and darkness. George Washington is a very iconic figure, which makes him quite difficult to draw in some ways. His face is probably one of the most recognizable symbols in American cultural life. Hopefully that's not too bad. Okay, now we will do Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, do you really have a good mental picture of him in your mind when you think about his name when I say it right now? Probably not. The pictures of Thomas Jefferson all tend to vary quite a bit, the portraits that you see of him. My general sense is that he's someone with a kind of stern expression, kind of a long chin, long nose, and of course this sort of long, wavy hair. He was thin and tall as well, so I'll try to give him a thin, sort of scraggly neck, and, you know, sort of small shoulders. In a lot of these 18th century paintings, people were not actually that great at creating depictions of folks, so you look at one painting to another and oftentimes the depiction tends to vary a fair bit. George Washington was pretty consistent, but Thomas Jefferson, I don't know. Just gonna give some color here. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had red hair. That was another one of his famous visual trademarks to the extent that anybody's aware of them. I gave him some freckles as well, you might see. So yeah, we'll just add a bit of color here, hopefully sort of thick him out a bit. I always think of Thomas Jefferson as he was depicted in Animaniacs in that one episode, where he sort of looked a bit like this, sort of a gaunt face, long pointed chin, sort of longish nose, and a kind of bemused facial expression. Thomas Jefferson, of course, great founding father, but more controversial man these days because of his whole take on slavery. All right, now let us try President Trump's allegedly favorite president, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a very interesting looking guy. He kind of had this worried expression on his face, sort of arched eyebrows, but it was this big sort of mop of hair that he had that was his most distinctive characteristic. It was kind of this big, wild, untamed mane, and a very high forehead as well. Yeah, sort of something like that. How did they dress in those days? It was kind of a weird time when he was president. It was sort of a transitionary time between the sort of 18th century style of dress and more contemporary suits. Sort of something like that, I guess, a bit. All right, let's add a bit of color here. You know, his hair was quite gray by the time he became president, as I'm sure my American friends will know from seeing his depiction on the $20 bill. He's another man that the depictions of him tend to vary a bit depending on who did the painting of him in question, or the wood block engraving, as it may happen to be. Sometimes he looks very old, sometimes they make him look quite young, even when he was allegedly in his later years. So I'm trying to make him look somewhere in between, a little bit old, but of course that hair really makes him look a lot younger. Yeah. Andrew Jackson, hero or villain? You tell me. All right, now we are going to do everybody's favorite and perhaps the most iconic president after George Washington. Can you guess who this is? Yes, probably. It's good old Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is quite easy to draw. I mean, he's been in so many cartoons over the years. There's kind of this sort of stock cartoon caricature of Abraham Lincoln. You know, long chin, big nose, big ears, quite a sort of ugly man, I suppose you could say. It's funny, when you read sort of contemporaneous accounts of Abraham Lincoln, from his partisan critics, people made a big deal about how ugly he was and how ape-like he was, and, you know, he was just this kind of grotesque person. But, you know, now I think we obviously recognize Abe Lincoln as a man who had many better qualities that compensated for whatever deficiencies in appearance he might have had. So, yeah, I guess you could say this is kind of the standard cartoon depiction of Abraham Lincoln. We're just going to add some shading here to just make him look even more, I suppose, homely. The big shadows in the ears and under the nose and all of this kind of thing. I think that this, his looks have sort of now helped perpetuate some of the myths of Abraham Lincoln. Not in a negative sense, but just in the sense that, you know, the more ugly and haggard he looks, the more it sort of emphasizes his internal qualities, his heroism, and his strength as a leader. I think we like the idea of a great leadership coming in unexpected packages. If he was a very handsome man, I don't think his mythology would be quite as powerful. Yeah. Alright, now we are going to do the man who came shortly after Abraham Lincoln. Do you know who this is? Great sort of Civil War general turned president. Man on the $50 bill, is it? Yes, Ulysses S Grant. Ulysses S Grant is kind of, I suppose, one of the generic bearded presidents that came in the aftermath of the Civil War. You know, this is Ulysses S Grant, but I suppose it could just as easily be, you know, Garfield or Hayes or Harrison, any of these kinds of presidents. But I always think of Ulysses S. Grant in particular as having this kind of very sad look. He had these kind of perpetually sad eyes, kind of drawing him with sort of closed eyes, but just this kind of arched eyebrows. And his facial features were very much hidden by that big beard of his. It was hard to see his lips, his mouth, when you look at photographs of him. And because, I mean, just like Lincoln, where you talk about sort of the physical characteristics becoming part and parcel of their political character, I think the fact that we recognize Ulysses S. Grant as being sort of a bad president, as a flawed or incompetent president, sort of manifests in the way that we think of his physical appearance too, as this kind of like sort of slumped, haggard-looking, kind of sad, somber sort of figure. As kind of a man who was just not great at his job and kind of seemed to know it, if you read his face at least. Yeah, something like that. All right, and now we are in the 20th century, and this was a man who I think we all quite know and love. Yes, it is Teddy Roosevelt, who is, of course, one of the great cartoonable presidential figures. He was perhaps in some ways the first sort of real cartoon character president, I suppose, in the sense that the caricaturists of his time really sort of went nuts with him. The big grinning mouth, the big mustache, the little glasses. His facial expression was always in this huge grin with his eyes like sort of squinting in joy. Kind of looks a bit like Dr. Robotnik here, which is supposedly, I don't know if this is true or not, but Robotnik in Sonic was supposedly based on sort of the cartoon depictions of Teddy Roosevelt, which sort of shows how the cartoon character of Teddy Roosevelt had sort of become a character in its own right, much like the cartoons of Lincoln or Nixon or some of the other presidents. So he's kind of a fun guy to draw. You don't really have to depict much about Teddy Roosevelt to get the essence of his character, which is something that you can't say about a lot of presidents, certainly not a lot about the old presidents who are not as well known, and thus you have to put a fair bit more detail into their caricature if you want it to be recognized. And even then, it can be pretty iffy. So, yeah, we'll just add a bit of shades to his teeth here. Good old Roosevelt. A fun man, a fun character. Still one of the most popular US presidents, even today, sort of coming back in fashion. His message of self-improvement is very much in fashion for our time. Yeah. All right, now let me try another sort of 19th century president. Do you know who this guy is? This is William Howard Taft, who I think is another very well-known, if not necessarily known in a political sense, but I think he's a president that all little kids learn about because of his big mustache, and also, as you've seen here, his sort of appalling obesity. We all learn the anecdotes about Taft having to be, pulled out of the bathtub by a crane or some nonsense like that. But anyway, the thing about Taft is, of course, his fatness, his big mustache, and also these little squinty eyes that he had. He looked very much like the sort of stereotypical jolly, plump robber baron type. He was a conservative man, the man who came after Teddy Roosevelt, who Roosevelt actually didn't like because he was seen as being too conservative when Roosevelt himself was more of a progressive-minded guy, even though he was a Republican. So this is basically just the essence of Taft, a fun president to draw, a fun sort of depiction. Actually, now that I think of it, Taft was in the 20th century. I said he was in the 19th century, but like I said, he just looks the part of a 19th century politician with the facial hair and the fatness and, you know, these bulging wallet chains and, you know, vests. The sort of stereotypical rich and out-of-touch politician. All right, now we will do the man who came after Taft. Do you know who that was? With the glasses. This was President Wilson. Wilson was this very sort of stark man, very somber former university professor, former university president. He had a very sort of stern, almost somewhat skeletal face, very tall. He was, I think, considered to be quite a puritanical man, very self-righteous was a criticism that you heard a lot about him. And so, kind of reflects in his face. You don't see a lot of great cartoons of Wilson, in part because he had a very boring face. It was always just kind of depicted as this very sort of stretched out look. And the way I drew him with his sort of opaque glasses, that was a sort of popular depiction as well, which I suppose sort of made him look even more, I don't know, soulless or mechanical in some ways. This was the great leader of World War I and the Versailles peace talks in the aftermath, which sort of helped consolidate his reputation as a very sort of moralizing, self-righteous man. He's become quite unpopular now because he was also quite racist, even by the standards of his time. Now, let us do another bespectacled president. Who is this one? Well, this is the other Roosevelt of the 20th century. It is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is most famous for his big grin, his little spectacles, his big broad chin, this fedora hat that he always wore, and one other very important prop that I will just get to here, which was his weird cigarette holder. Don't see these things anymore these days. I believe that these were things that old people used to use to smoke in order to keep their teeth clean. Think of, Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's, but Roosevelt was famous for having one as well. Roosevelt, unique among presidents in the amount of props that he had. Not only his little glasses, his cigarette thing, his fedora hat, he also wore bow ties. He was also, of course, in a wheelchair, which, if I was drawing a full-body depiction of him, I would make a big deal about, with the little blanket over his legs. But Roosevelt's sort of big, grinning face and this big, jutting chin. I really like looking at caricatures of FDR from, the 20s and 30s and 40s. The caricaturists of that time really had a lot of fun with him and really depicted him in this very sort of charming way. He was, of course, a very beloved president and one that was difficult to always draw mean-spirited caricatures of. All right, and who came after Roosevelt? It was Harry S. Truman, the other sort of bespectacled president of the 20th century. Harry Truman had these big glasses that really sort of dominated his face, and he had a very square head as well. Very sort of kind-looking man, sort of owlish in his sort of face. Very short. I think he was one of the shortest presidents as well. He, like Roosevelt before him, always wore bow ties. He also tended to wear very sort of snappy outfits, often very light-colored suits. He was a former haberdasher, a man who used to sell hats. He had a men's clothing store in Missouri, which is where I think he was from. Truman is an example of a president who I think is coming more popular these days. He was very unpopular in his own time. People forget that, but yeah, he left office as one of the least liked presidents, but we now think of him as more of a statesman. Yeah, not so bad. Okay, and after Truman was Eisenhower. I always think Eisenhower is just a very strange-looking man. He was, of course, the great World War II winning general, but he had this weird, almost sort of babyish face. Big bald head. He didn't have a lot of lines in his face. He had these big sort of ears that jutted out. And he had these little beady eyes, this like very sort of boyish grin. He had a kind of sort of small build as well. I think he was rather short. But just, I don't know, just never looked like the kind of person that you'd expect if you read his biography and sort of had to pick his photograph out of a lineup. Just this big forehead, this just almost completely balding, just very like thin little wrinkles around his eyes. Just the kind of odd-looking guy, but you know, he's relatively easy to draw. You don't see a lot of cartoons about him though, because he was quite a well-liked president in his own time, and I don't think that there was really that much going on politically then. So that's not so bad.
So I hope you all enjoyed this latest round of JJ Draws Presidents. If you would like me to do more drawing videos in the future, please let me know in the comments below. And it doesn't just have to be politicians either. I mean, I can draw lots of different stuff. But anyway, I will be seeing you soon, and thanks again for all of the subs and likes and shares. Looking forward to making you guys even more great videos in 2018.